I'm Saskia van Nauhuis, and I'm a professor of ecology at the Indian Institute of Science in the Department of Ecological Sciences. And today's lecture is going to be about continuing with species interactions. And the specific kinds of interactions I'm going to be talking about today are mutualism and facilitation. So these are positive interactions among species. So we've already gone over some very important interactions among species that we talk about in ecology, such as competition, which is usually a competition for an important resource. And so one of the results of the competition is it has a negative impact on either both of the species involved or one of the species involved. Also, predation, which is good for the predator and bad for the thing being eaten. So that's a consumer-resource relationship, which is positive, negative. And then parasitism and infectious disease, so parasitism and pathogens, which is also a positive, negative consumer-resource interaction. And the topic of this lecture is another type of interaction, which is mutualism and facilitation. And so these two are quite similar. One of them is a positive interaction between species, which is positive for both species. And the other one is when there's an interaction between the species, which is positive for one of the species and neutral for the other. All right. So what are some types of positive interactions? Again, defining what mutualism and facilitation are. So a mutualism is a reciprocally positive interaction between different species. And reciprocally positive means positive for both. And that interaction can be obligate, like that interaction has to be there in order for them to exist, or it can be facultative. They can take advantage of it if they need to, if it's available, but they don't need it to survive. And usually, whatever benefit a species gets, there's some cost also. So they pay some price for this positive interaction for the most part. In facilitation, and also commensalism, which depending on your definition is the same as facilitation, it's positive for one species and neutral for the other. And so some people call this commensalism, and some people distinguish facilitation as being that one species might sort of intentionally enhance the situation for another species to no benefit of their own. But I'm just going to say they're the same, positive, zero. And so you'll see examples of all of these things. Another sort of type of a interaction to keep in mind, especially when we're talking about mutualism, is symbiosis. So symbiosis is a very close long-term, meaning long-term over evolutionary time, biological interaction between two different biological organisms. And that interaction can be mutualistic or commensal or parasitic. Very often when people say symbiotic interaction, they're talking about a mutualist interaction. For example, lichen in this picture is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and bacteria. And so meaning that, is a symbiotic relationship between a fungus and a bacteria. It's an obligate interaction and it's a mutualism. They both benefit. But the term symbiosis is also used more broadly to mean a very long-term interaction, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a mutualism. So not all mutualisms are symbiotic, and not all symbioses are mutualists. Okay, so I'm going to start out just with some examples of mutualisms, which might be the best way for you all to understand what kind of interaction these are. Okay, so lichen, as I mentioned, is a mutualism between algae or cyanobacteria and at least one fungus. There could be several fungi. And so remember, since this is a mutualism, there's a benefit for everybody, and there's usually a cost for everybody. So the benefit for the fungus is food, and the food it gets because the alga is photosynthetic, so it produces carbohydrate, and so the fungus gets the food, and then the algae gets protection and sort of structure and habitat. Okay, so those are the benefits, and then what are the costs? So for the algae, there's some loss of food, so some of the products of its photosynthesis it's giving up, so that's a cost. And then the fungus loses some nutrients that it gets from the surroundings that it gives to the algae, but it doesn't actually have a huge cost. Okay, so that's one example of a mutualism. Another example of a mutualism is plants and mycorrhizae fungi, which have an association with plants through the roots. And so the mycorrhizae fungi benefit by gaining sugar from the plant, and again, those sugars are what the plant makes during photosynthesis. And the plant benefits by access to water from the soil and access to nutrients from the soil that the fungus transfers to it. And then in this case, the cost for both of the taxa is having less of whatever it's giving. So the plant gives up some of its own sugar, and the fungus gives up some of its own nutrients and water. Another example of a mutualism, the relationship between, in insects, the relationship between ants and aphids. So aphids feed on plant phloem, so that's the phloem is fluid that is inside of plant tissue. And so lots of times when you see aphids on plants, you also see ants tending the aphids. And so the benefit for the ants of this is they get access to food. And the food they get access to is called honeydew. And that's because the aphids are feeding on the plant fluids, so they're sort of attached to the plant, and then sugars from the plant, some of them, because of the pressure, they just go right through the aphid and they come out the rear end of the aphid, and the plant gets to eat these sugars. So that's honeydew. The aphids get protection from their natural enemies, from parasites or predators, by the ants. So the ants defend the aphids. Okay, so what's the cost? They both get these clear benefits, food and protection. The cost for the ants is that they have to spend time and energy taking care of the aphids, so they're pretty much there continuously watching over the aphids. And the cost for the aphids is a few things. In an extreme case, the cost to the aphid, so aphids mostly don't have wings, but when the aphid density gets very high, then some of the individuals develop wings in order to disperse to a new place. The ants would like to not have the aphids fly away and disperse to a new place. So there's examples when one of the costs to the aphids is when they develop wings, the ants clip them off, and so they can't disperse, or sometimes they hormonally inhibit them from developing wings. So that's one cost to the aphids. And then in some situation, the ants soliciting food makes them give up more honeydew than they naturally would give up, so they lose a little bit of food. Okay, so it's definitely, in all of these cases, there's definitely a benefit for both species. So both species have an increased fitness, or in fact, almost their whole fitness in some cases, can be tied up in this mutualistic interaction, but there is also a cost. All right, so now I'm going to talk about sort of the most well-known mutualism, which is the mutualism between flowering plants and their pollinating pollinators. Okay, so first, just about pollinators. So we think about flowers and bees, but there of course are other pollinators. And so there's bats, reptiles, birds, rodents, and then even among the insects, not all of the pollinators are bees. Okay, so there's lots of different kinds of pollinators. And many of them, but not all of them, have a mutualistic interaction with the plants. Okay, so this mutualistic interaction is very important to plants. So 3/4 of all flowering plants received pollinator services. And so you ask, well, what about the other quarter? So the other quarter either self-pollinates, or the pollen is distributed through wind or other means, water, something like that, not by not in a biotic method. And this mutualism has driven the diversity of plants and the diversity of pollinators if we think over evolutionary time. So it's a super important mutualism. Okay, so let's identify the benefits and the costs to both players. Okay, so the benefits to the plant. Well, it gets pollination. So what's great about pollination? So pollination, you can think about it at two levels. So at the level of the individual, well, they need, many of them at least, they need pollen in order to fertilize, go into the ovary, fertilize, and grow the fruit. So they need the pollen for that. They also, as a species, they need gene flow. And so the pollination is necessary for sexual reproduction of plants. Okay, what does the animal get? So they get nectar. So that's sugars that are produced by the plant for the pollinators. They get pollen. Many insects and some other creatures eat pollen. They get resin and wax, which is another thing that the plants have evolved to produce extra of for the benefit of the pollinators. Okay, then what's the costs for each of the species? So for the plant, the cost is sort of easy to figure out because they have to have these floral displays. They make nectar, which is, is sugars. They do the sort of the whole what they have to offer has a cost to them. But what about the animal? You think, okay, they go and they get some nectar and they get pollen on them, and then they go to another plant and the pollen goes off on another plant, and that doesn't really cost them anything. But there are various costs. So one of them is, especially if you think about bees, say bees have specialized pollen carrying parts of their body. And in fact, their morphology is all coordinated with the plant so that they can gather and also disperse pollen. And so they have hairs on their thorax that where pollen rubs onto the thorax, and then when they come to another flower, it runs off. So they have morphology that's specialized. So that would come at a cost. And then they've kind of made a behavioral deal, because if they're going to, if the plant is going to be very well suited to them in terms of providing the things they need, then they are going to be kind of limited to using that plant, and so or that category of plants. And so often you could think of the specialization that comes in some plant-pollinator association as a constraint. It means that if that plant isn't there, they're going to be in trouble. So one of the costs is sort of a limitation in the breadth of their resource use. All right. So nectar and other things that plants produce are quite expensive and attractive things. And so are there cheaters in the system? So in mutualist systems, are there cheaters around? And the answer is yes. So then we think about, okay, cheaters by the pollinators. So the sort of most straightforward way that pollinators can cheat is by collecting nectar without getting pollen on them and distributing pollen among the flowers. And so you can see in this picture, this bumblebee, bombus, is, so here is the flower, opening of the flower, where it could go and get nectar, and if it did that, it would get pollen on it. But instead, it's making a hole down here at the base and taking the nectar without bothering with getting the pollen on it. So it's a nectar robber. So in this case, it's a cost to the plant and a benefit to the bee, and it's not a mutualism. All right, so the pollinators can cheat. There's other examples. And the plants can cheat. So for example, a plant can have attractive colors and scents, and meaning odors, that give a signal to the pollinator that there's going to be nectar, and then the pollinator goes there and there isn't any nectar. So they look like a flower that would have nectar, but they don't have any nectar. They can also, and so that's one kind of cheating. Another kind of cheating is that they can, say, mimic the odor or mimic the way that a female of the pollinator species looks, and they can get the pollinator species to come and think it's going to mate with the flower, but instead it ends up transporting the pollen. So this is, in this case, the flower is mimicking an insect in order to attract the mate of the insect. And then in the process of trying to mate with the flower, the insect gets pollen on it, and then the next time it goes to the next flower hoping to mate with it transfers the pollen. So in this way, again, the plant is cheating. It's not providing any nectar for the pollinator. All right, so there's cheating in mutualism. There can be. All right, so a little more detail now about plant-pollinator mutualism, and this kind of generalizes to lots of kinds of mutualism. So as I mentioned, the mutualism can be obligate or facultative. So obligate means the species have to be together. Both species have to exist for either one of them to exist. And facultative means that they can either they can take advantage of it if it's there, but they don't need it. Okay, so if both are obligate, both species are obligate, then it's called reciprocal dependency. And so the classic example of reciprocal dependency is the yucca plant and the yucca moth, this little beautiful gray moth here. So the yucca plant, there's several species of yucca plants and there's several species of yucca moths. And any one species of yucca plants can't make seeds without pollination by the yucca moth. It doesn't have no other pollinator can successfully get pollen in the ovary. And the moth larvae can only reach maturity if they eat developing yucca seeds. So in this case, the yucca moth comes and it's pollinating, but it's also laying eggs in the plant. And so one of the costs to the plants of this close association is that it gives up some of its seeds for the development of the yucca moth. But the benefit that it gets in exchange for that is that the yucca moth will only be pollinating this one plant, and actually it doesn't take any nectar or anything. It's just looking for somewhere to lay eggs. So they have this obligate reciprocal dependency. There's also examples where one of the players is obligate and the other one is facultative. So it could be that one plant species needs a certain bee species, and that's the only bee species that pollinates it. But that bee species, while it would benefit from the plant, it can live without pollen. So bees don't need nectar and pollen in order to survive. They like it, but they don't need it. And a bee pollen, on the other hand, there are some bee pollinators that are dependent on pollen. For example, some bees will feed pollen to their brood, and so they may be dependent, and they may even be dependent on quite specific pollen. But then the plants that they are pollinators of could actually use many different pollinator species. So they're not dependent on any one of the pollinators, even though that one pollinator might be dependent on them. And then another sort of aspect of this obligate versus facultative interaction is that some plants can self-pollinate, but they also benefit from the visitation of pollinators. And so for example, if there's pollinators around, then they get to have gene flow within the population or among population of the plants, which overall is good. But if there aren't pollinators around, then the plants will still persist over generations by self-fertilizing. Okay. Another way that we categorize plant pollinator mutualism is through the specificity of the interaction. And so here's an example of very specific interactions. So this is fig trees and fig wasps. So fig wasps pollinate flowers of figs while they lay eggs inside of the figs. So the wasp larva consumes some of the fig seeds, developing seeds, but it also pollinates them. And for each, and there's many different species of fig trees, say 700 different species, and each species of fig tree is pollinated by one or just a few species of fig wasps. And so if you look at the phylogeny of the wasps, shown here in blue, and the phylogeny of the figs, shown here, this is a fraction of the phylogeny, then we see that there's like a phylogenetic congruency between the figs and the wasps, meaning that new species of them have evolved together. So this is a very specific interaction. This is in contrast to a diffuse interaction, which a lot of pollination is diffuse like this. And so this is a diagram showing a pollination network. So we see a bunch of different species of pollinators. We could say different species of bees, but they could be other things, and a bunch of different species of plants. And you can see that each plant is visited by multiple pollinators, and each pollinator visits multiple plant species. So in this case, they have a mutualist interaction, but it's diffuse. They're not specific species-species interaction. So this is super common. This might be the most common. And if we think of honeybees, so in the genus Apis, those bees are very, they have many host plants. They go to many different species of flowers. They'll go to many hundreds of species of flowers. And then if you think from the point of view of the plant, a white mangrove tree, it may be, when it's in flower, there's at least 65 different pollinator species that are coming to it. So this is a mutualism, but it's diffuse, not one-to-one. Okay, so that was mutualism, and we'll get back to it, but now I'm going to talk about facilitation. Okay, so facilitation, examples. Birds nesting in a tree. The birds have a place to nest, the tree doesn't benefit, or it says, or no cost, probably. Sea cucumbers and shrimp, supposedly. Shrimp are attached to sea cucumbers and they get transported around, and apparently there's no cost to the sea cucumbers. Golden jackal and tigers. Okay, there's a tiger, golden jackal. There is a phenomenon that golden jackals, especially if they're alone, will follow around tigers and eat the leftovers of their prey, and supposedly this comes at no cost to the tigers. Similarly, whales and barnacles. Barnacles are on whales, and they don't appear to have a cost to the whales, but the barnacles benefit from getting moved around. You could also say humans and trees. Trees provide us shade, we enjoy them, and they don't benefit much from us, although they could. Okay. So if we think about species interactions, they often occur on some kind of a continuum. So I'm talking about mutualisms and facilitations. So something could be depending on the context it's in, it could be a mutualism or a facilitation or a parasitism or competition. So what do I mean by context dependent? I'll give you an example. Back to the mycorrhizal fungi and plant roots. So plants give mycorrhizae carbohydrate, and mycorrhizae give plants water and nutrients, especially phosphorus. So looking at panel A here, we see the plant shoot, the plant root, and the mycorrhizal fungi. So this is fungus, so this is underground. The plant gives the fungus carbon, the fungus gives the plant phosphorus and nitrogen. Okay, say you add nitrogen fertilizer to the soil and there's already a lot of phosphorus in the soil. It's a phosphorus-rich soil. Okay, then the plant doesn't need the fungus to get its phosphorus and nitrogen anymore. It can get it directly from the soil. So then, but the fungus is still there and it's getting carbohydrate from the plant, and so adding the fertilizer to the soil has made this relationship, switched it from being a mutualism to being a parasitism. The fungus is a parasite of the plant. Okay, so say instead of putting nitrogen into phosphorus-rich soil, you put nitrogen into phosphorus-limited soil. Okay, so you add nitrogen, but there's not enough phosphorus, and so it's phosphorus limited. Then the plant can really do well because it's got this extra nitrogen, especially if it has the mutualistic interaction with the fungus, and so then the mutualism is enhanced. So the mutualism is stronger in this picture than it is without the nitrogen fertilizer. Finally, if say you increase the light intensity, or you increase the amount of CO2, then the plant can more easily make more carbohydrate. And then the fungus can benefit more because the plant is giving it a lot of carbohydrate. And if there's still a lot of nutrients, then the fungus can give the nutrients to the plant and everybody does better. And so again, in this case, the mutualism is enhanced. So the context variation in here is what resources are available. So depending on which resources are available, the interaction can shift from being mutualistic to parasitic, and the amount of mutualism can vary. All right. More context dependency. So say you have a situation where you have some small plants, these are strawberries, growing next to a big plant, say an apple tree. So apple trees, when they flower, they just flower this huge number of flowers. Okay. So this is competition for pollinators. So the plants, the strawberries, are competing with the apple tree for pollinators. And all the pollinators are going to this tree, which has so many flowers on it, and they're not paying attention to these strawberries with just a little bit of flowers. So there's competition between the tree and the strawberries. Another situation could be that having the apple tree there attracts more pollinators to the whole system, and they don't get distracted by all of the flowers on that tree. It's just having more flowers in the vicinity makes there be more pollinators around. And in that case, the strawberries, the apple tree is facilitating the strawberries having more pollinators. They're not competing. The apple tree is just attracting more pollinators, and some of them go to the strawberries. Okay, so again, this is context dependent. Now we could say, let's see, I think I said that. Yeah, neighboring plant can compete for pollinators, or the increased density can add pollinators. And there's examples of both of these things. Now we could ask, how exactly would that difference between facilitation and competition work? And actually, the way we can think about it the best is it's a variation in behavior of the pollinators. Okay, so if in the scenario of competition, if you look at the number of flowers visited by pollinators as a function of the density of flowers in the surrounding, when the density is low, they can't visit a lot, and as the density increases, they visit more, but at some point, they can just visit them they're visiting them as fast as they can. And so it levels off, and it doesn't matter if you add more flowers. And so that's a competitive situation. So in this case, the strawberries miss out because they've added so many flowers in the apple. It can be facilitation if, when the flower density is low, the pollinators are not attracted to the system. They just don't know, if there's not very many flowers, they don't go there. And so having more flowers around makes them be attracted to the situation. And as long as there's not too many flowers around, then having the neighboring plant is facilitating pollination between the two neighbors. Okay, so it's a behavior that affects whether it's facilitation or competition. Okay, so one kind of interesting thing that people think about a lot is how do mutualisms evolve? Because it's like, you sort of think it's cooperation. How could that happen? And so instead of thinking of mutualism as cooperation, you could think of mutualism as reciprocal exploitation. You could think the two are not helping each other. They're both like reciprocally taking advantage of each other. That's another way to think of it. And so they're both taking advantage of each other, but they're willing to pay a cost to do that. And then that makes it easier to imagine it evolving. So mutualism can evolve from competition. So when things are competing, they both need the same resource, but there's other resources that they need that they're not competing for. So if they can provide something else for the other one, then they can get more of what they want. And so it can kind of, it's like trading one resource for another. Mutualism can also evolve from parasitism. So, and this is a little bit more complicated to think of at first. So if you think of a disease, then organisms have immune response to a disease. And then the disease has resistance to the immune response. And that immune response and that resistant response is costly. So it's costly to mount an immune reaction, and it's costly to mount a resistance. And so if there is a parasite and it's very costly to keep fighting against the resistance of the host, then the parasite might have higher fitness if it switches to providing something to the host. And that way, it can kind of strengthen the host because the host is using up all of its energy in fighting against it. And then bit by bit, instead of being a parasite, then it can say, oh, well, if you don't have to have any immune response, then you can have lots of energy to provide resources for the parasite. And then it can evolve from a parasitic relationship to a mutualistic one. So these are both plausible things. And the mutualist from parasitism is one that has probably happened a lot. And so here's one example of detecting evolution of mutualism from parasitism. All right, so proteobacteria, which are gram-negative bacteria, is a big group, and so this is showing the phylogenetic relationship among the proteobacteria. And if you look at all the different proteobacteria, some of them are free-living. They might be in the soil or in the water or on surfaces. Some of them are parasitic, and then we call them disease, such as salmonella. So like a parasitic proteobacteria is a disease. And then some of them are mutualistic. They may aid hosts in digestion. So they live in the gut, and they help hosts digest things that they can't digest themselves. So these are this one category of bacteria, and different lineages might be free-living, parasitic, or mutualistic. And so you can ask, of those different kinds of lifestyles, which ones evolved most commonly from which other ones? Okay, so that's what these people did, Sachs et al., in this paper about the origin of proteobacteria mutualists. So if we look at this picture close up, we see these red and green marked lineages. And so the red marked lineages are parasitic, and the green marked lineages are mutualistic. So by looking at the phylogenetic relationships, following them back down, you can say, okay, did this parasitic one evolve from, was its ancestor mutualistic or neither, or parasitic? What was its ancestor? And what we find is that many of the green lineages, the mutualistic lineages, evolved from red ones. So that means almost all, there's just a few examples that don't go that way, almost all of the mutualistic lineages evolved from lineages that were parasitic. So this is evidence that this second mechanism, mutualism evolving from parasitism, is something that has happened, at least in this bacteria. All right. So again, we might think, oh, it's strange to imagine the evolution of mutualism because it seems cooperative. And then if you think of it, oh, it's not really cooperative. It's like mutual exploitation. And then the evolution becomes easier to think about. So we see that most mutualistic lineages of proteobacteria evolved from parasites rather than from free-living proteobacteria that were not parasitic. And so one of the reasons, and so there's two sort of ways to think about why that evolution would be easy, relatively. So one of them is that, as I mentioned in the previous slide, that where the host has already, where there's already a host parasite, or a host, where there's already a relationship between a host and parasite, they're already kind of living together. And so they're already sort of in the host. And so some sort of evolutionary relationship is already happening. And so that's kind of a boost. And then also, where they both are already exhibiting a cost, because it's costly to have resistance and it's costly to have immunity. And so both of them can benefit by toning down on the immunity and on the resistance. And so that makes that evolution go more quickly, or be more likely to happen. Okay, so I covered a lot of different things here, ecology and evolution. So positive interactions are really common and they're really important. And such as flowering plants. And while we have a lot of ecological theory about, say, competition and about predator-prey interactions and host-parasite interactions, we actually have less ecological theory sort of behind mutualist interactions, but they are super common. I gave the definitions of mutualism and commensalism facilitation, and I gave some examples. I focused in on pollination and pointed out that there can be cheaters. I talked about that these interactions between species that are positive can be either very specific, species-species interactions, or they can be diffuse, and they can be specific for one player and diffuse for the other, and vice versa. There's sort of all different versions of it. And then I talked about these interactions as being context dependent. So they can be positive or negative depending on the context that they're in. And so, for example, with the soil mycorrhizae and the roots, it depends on the soil nutrients and the amount of sunlight or CO2 in the atmosphere, whether or not it's a parasitism or it's a mutualism. And then finally, mutualism can evolve from other negative interactions, so evolving from competition or evolving from parasitism. And I gave an example of mutualism evolving from parasitism in the proteobacteria. That's it.